The manifest was 41 pages long. Not 41 pages of names, there were no names. It was 41 pages of inventory codes, each one a string of 17 alphanumeric characters, assigned by the Thurvik Dominion's Bureau of Biologic Acquisitions, and beside each code, there was a physical description, height in their units of measurement, which I had long since learned to translate, weight, approximate age at time of acquisition, a behavioral compliance score on a scale of 1 to 9, and a resale value in Dominion trade credits. At the bottom of each entry, in a smaller typeface, there was a status field. The status field had 3 possible values. Active, meaning the subject was still in service somewhere in the Dominion's client network. Retired, meaning the subject had been removed from service for reasons of physical deterioration. Voided, meaning the subject had died. 9,211 entries. 6,431 marked active. 2,119 marked retired. 661 marked voided. I had the manifest in a sealed transit case handcuffed to my left wrist, and I carried it off the Morova Station Transit pod and through the secondary arrivals corridor and into a room that smelled like recycled air and old coffee, and I sat it on the table in front of Director Callan Price, and I unlocked the cuffs, and I slid the case to him, and I said, 9,211, 41 years. He opened it, he read the first page, he closed it, he said, "How confident are you in this documentation?" I said. It came out of their own bureau system. I had a Thurvak archivist with clearance pull it. She thought she was running a client audit for a senior acquisitions official. I was the official. Price looked at me for a long moment. He had the kind of face that had stopped showing things years before we met, which was one of the reasons he was good at his job, and one of the reasons working for him was difficult. 41 years, he said. The first documented acquisition was in the year that translates to 41 standard years ago, I said. Their internal records suggest the program was already running before the first documented entry. The manifest reflects only confirmed acquisitions processed through the Bureau. There may be earlier extractions that didn't enter the formal system, he said. Where were you able to identify origin points? 63% of the active entries have port of acquisition codes that match human colonial shipping lanes in the Verith corridor, cargo freighters mostly, a few colony transports. The acquisitions happened during transit. Ships went dark, and when they were found, they had been relieved of some portion of their human passengers. The investigations at the time logged them as piracy incidents with casualties. Nobody identified the pattern because nobody was looking for a pattern. They were 41 separate incidents spread over 4 decades across 3 transit corridors. Nobody identified a pattern, Price repeated. No, he was quiet. I had been quiet about it for 6 years, and the quiet had become a different kind of thing inside me. Not a sense of sound, but a presence, pressure behind the eyes, like something that had been compressed so long it had changed its state. I was not going to say this to Price. It was not relevant. The holding facilities, he said. The primary concentration facility is on Verith Secundus, secondary holdings on 3 client worlds. I have coordinates for 2 of them, probabilities for the 3rd. The second facility is the administrative center of the program. The Bureau headquarters are there. The processing infrastructure, intake, documentation, conditioning, distribution to client purchasers, is all there. Conditioning, he said. Their word, I said. Picked up the transit case. He turned it over in his hands once, set it down, he said, "I want a full debrief in 6 hours. Get something to eat, get cleaned up." He looked at me again. "When did you last sleep?" I tried to remember. "On the transit, before that." I said I didn't know. He nodded, the way he nodded when something confirmed a thing he already believed, and he wasn't going to say what it was. He picked up his desk communicator and he said, "Get me the deputy director and get me a room." I left. In the corridor outside the debriefing suites, I stopped walking, and I stood with my back against the wall, and I looked at the ceiling, which was a shade of off-white that had been that same shade of off-white since before I joined the service, and I thought about the first entry in the manifest. Inventory code TDA 29010047 CQB, height, weight, age at acquisition, approximately 11 standard years, behavioral compliance score, 7, status, voided. In the remarks field, which was supposed to be left blank, and sometimes wasn't. An acquisitions officer had written, in the Thurvac administrative dialect I had spent a year learning. Diminutive specimen, limited utility, unprofitable to maintain. I had read the manifest 3 times on the transit from Vareth station to Morova. I thought I had already felt everything it was possible to feel about it. Standing in that corridor, I understood that I had been wrong. I walked to the end of the corridor, found the cafeteria, and sat down with a cup of coffee and did not drink it. The debrief lasted 11 hours. They brought in a full analytical team partway through. 6 people I didn't know, 2 I recognized from other programs. 1 woman who didn't introduce herself, and who asked better questions than anyone else in the room. The manifest was duplicated and distributed, and the copies were walked through by 3 separate authentication specialists, while I answered questions about the acquisition methodology, the bureau structure, the archivist, my cover, the conditions at Vareth Secundus, the physical layout of the primary facility, the estimated population of the active holding, and the Dominion's military posture in the Vareth corridor. At the end of the 11th hour, Price said, "How much of this has been shared with Dominion-adjacent intelligence sources?" I said. "None of it." The archivist believed she was running a routine audit. I was out of her network within 22 hours of acquiring the manifest. Records will show a standard audit completed with no anomalies. If there was a flag, I'd know. There was no flag, he said. And you've been out of Thurvac space for 67 days. He nodded. He looked at the woman who hadn't introduced herself. She said, "We can authenticate within 48 hours. The provenance question is going to require an independent assessment of the acquisition codes against known missing persons records." I said, "I have a list, not complete." I was able to cross-reference 97 entries against transit incident, records from the corridor investigations, the acquisition codes match, the dates match, the port of acquisition codes match. The woman wrote something. She said, "You cross-referenced 97. It was the number I could do manually, with what I had access to in the field. A full database search would produce more, possibly many more." The room was quiet for a moment. Then the woman said, "Thank you, Agent Ostrava. It was the first time anyone had used my name in 6 years. The authentication took 31 hours, not 48. The independent cross-reference of acquisition codes against missing persons records, transit incident reports, and the corridor investigation archives produced 2,316 confirmed matches. The remaining entries could not be confirmed individually but fit the established pattern with a statistical probability the analysts described as conclusive. The brief went to the Parliamentary Defense Committee 8 days after I walked off the transit pod. I know this because Price told me, and because I was in a medical facility on Morova Station, being told by a physician that my blood markers suggested extended malnutrition, and that I should consider rest as a legitimate priority rather than a scheduling inconvenience. I told the physician I would consider it. I did not consider it. 12 days after I walked off the pod, the brief went to the full Parliament. The vote was not close. The authorized instrument was formally designated Standing Order 14 Compact, and it created a combined force operational structure called the Ardent Compact. 380 warships drawn from 7 fleet commands, 7 ground assault divisions, including elements of the 4th, 9th, and 12th Colonial Defense Brigades, and a standing mandate that described the operation in 5 words of official language. Full and complete redress of account. The order had no expiration date. It had no withdrawal clause. It had no provision for the Dominion to negotiate terms prior to execution. I had delivered had established beyond the standard of reasonable certainty that the Thurvac Dominion had been systematically extracting human beings from human shipping lanes and selling them into permanent servitude for 41 years, that the Dominion government was fully aware of and administratively responsible for this program, that the Dominion had maintained official diplomatic relations with Earth for 37 of those 41 years without ever acknowledging or halting the program, and that 9,211 documented human beings had passed through the Dominion's bureau system as biological inventory. The Parliament did not debate at length. Price told me this. He said the chamber was very quiet for most of the session. He said the vote was recorded in 8 minutes. I was still in the medical facility when he told me. I was sitting on the edge of the examination bed in a paper gown, looking at the door. I said, "I want to go," he said. "You're not fit for a combat deployment. I'm not asking to run a ground assault. I'm asking to embed with the force as an intelligence asset and a witness." He looked at me for a long time. The pressure behind my eyes had been there since the corridor outside the debriefing suite, and it had not gone away. "The physician," he started, "is concerned about blood markers," I said. "I can walk without assistance. I can perform analytical tasks. I know the layout of the Secundus facility better than anyone else currently alive who isn't a Thurvac national. I know their security protocols, their shift rotations, their communication infrastructure, and the administrative hierarchy. You will put me on that deployment." "Yael," I said. "I brought them the manifest. I want to be there when it closes." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Embedded. Combat role, you answer to compact command." "Yes. And you sleep," he said, "properly before departure." I said I would, and that time, I actually did. The Ardent Compact assembled at Mirova Station over 19 days. I had been in space for 6 of my last 7 years, but I had mostly been in it alone, or in small covert configurations. 2 or 3 people. Transit-class vessel that could pass for a prospecting ship. Enough cover to hold for the time it needed to hold. I had not been inside a military formation in 11 years. Not since my original intelligence training rotation, and I had never been inside one at this scale. 380 warships is not a number that means anything until you are standing at a viewport watching them move. I was given a bunk on the Tanveth, which was a cruiser attached to the 4th Fleet Command element and serving as an intelligence coordination vessel for the operation. My role was formally listed as Senior Attached Analyst, which meant I was available to Compact Command for facility assessment and operational planning questions, but was not integrated into any ground assault unit structure. I attended planning briefings, I answered questions. I ate in the officer's mess and slept in an actual bunk and let the physicians on the Tanveth continue doing things with my blood markers that they described as routine recovery protocols, and that I found less objectionable than the equivalent on Mirova Station because, at least here we were, The Compact transited toward the Vareth corridor in formation. There were 19 days of transit, and I spent them doing what analysts do: reading documentation, updating facility assessments, reviewing the secondary site coordinates, running probabilities on the tertiary site. There was also a lot of time in the evenings when I was not working, and in that time, I did something that was not in my job description, and that I had told myself I would not do, which was read the manifest again. Not all 41 pages. I couldn't do all 41 pages, but I would read sections of it. A column of inventory codes, cluster of entries from a single acquisition event. There were events where 3, 4, 5 entries had the same port of acquisition code and the same date, which meant they had been taken together, which meant they had probably known each other, or been family, or at least had the minimal human comfort of not being alone in what was happening to them in those first hours. I would read those clusters and I would think about the transit incident reports from those dates. The dry official language about disabled ships and missing passengers and inconclusive evidence regarding the responsible party, and I would try to hold both documents in my mind at the same time, and understand what it meant that those 2 documents existed in the same universe, and one of them had been written by people who would never see the other. I told the 9th Brigade's intelligence officer, a major named Dessa Folau, some of what I had been thinking. Not all of it. The manifest wasn't something I had the right to share informally, but I told her about the acquisition clusters. The groups taken on the same date from the same ship. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "We're going to get them out." I said, "Some of them." She said, "All of the active entries we can get to." I said, 61% are on Secundus. The rest are distributed across the client network. The compact authorization covers the secondary sites. We'll need parallel operations, and even if all 3 run simultaneously, there may be client purchasers with active holdings that we don't have coordinates for. There are gaps in the manifest. It's their official record. There were unofficial acquisitions they didn't log. Carl was quiet for a moment, then she said, "We know about that." "I know you know," I said. I stopped. She said, "You want to say it out loud?" "Yes." She nodded. She poured 2 cups of the remarkably bad coffee that the Tanveth produced from its mess unit, and she handed me one and she said, "Say it." "Some of them," I said. "Even if everything goes exactly right, even at maximum operational success, some of them we don't get to in time. Some of them we can't locate. Some of them are in the status field entries that say retired. And we don't know what that means for their current condition. And the 661 voided entries are gone. They're already gone. They were gone before I walked into Price's office with the transit case. I spent 6 years getting the manifest out, and 61 of those 9,211 people were already gone before I even had the count." Folo held her coffee cup. She said, "Yes, I know the operation is right. I know what it's going to do. I'm not." I couldn't finish the sentence. "You don't have to justify the operation to me," she said, "or the grief." I drank the bad coffee. Outside the viewport, the compact was moving. 380 ships in staggered formation, and in the darkness between them the stars were very still. She said, after a while, "How did you do it? 6 years." I thought about how to answer that. Not the practical answer. The cover identities, the language acquisition, the archivist, the 22 hours between extracting the manifest and clearing the network. Those were in the debrief record, and she could read them any time. She was asking something else, I said. There was a point, about 18 months in, when I understood that I wasn't going to be able to get out quickly. The acquisition pattern I'd identified was broad enough to require a deeper embed than the original mission parameters allowed for. I could have aborted and reported what I had. It was already significant, already enough to confirm the program existed. But it wouldn't have been enough to authorize a response at scale. Without the scope, without the full manifest, the diplomatic channel would have had room to operate. The Dominion would have denied, and then negotiated, and then stalled. And the program would have continued under a different name in a different part of their client network, while the diplomatic process ran its course. So you stayed. So I stayed, I said, and after about the 2nd year, the question of how I was doing it stopped being something I thought about, because the answer was just one day, and then another day, and then another day. The same way anyone does anything over a long enough span. You don't carry the whole weight all at once. You just carry today's portion. She looked at me. She said, "And what was today's portion?" I said, making sure the formation was reading the secondary site coordinates correctly against the facility assessments I'd filed. She almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile that people produce when something is accurate, rather. She said, "The 12th Brigade's element has reviewed the coordinates 3 times. "I know," I said. "I reviewed their review." "I know," she said. "I saw the annotation log." We drank the bad coffee, the formation moved. 19 days of transit was both too long and not long enough. Too long because every day was another day the active entries in the manifest were still in the status they were in, and not long enough because at the end of 19 days, something was going to happen that I had spent 6 years working toward, and I found, sitting in the officer's mess of the Tanveth with a cup of bad coffee, and 380 ships visible through the viewport, that I did not know with certainty what it was going to do to me when it did. Folau set down her cup. She said, "Get some sleep, Yale." I said I would try. I went back to my bunk and read 4 more pages of the manifest and then put it down and looked at the ceiling until the transit's white noise hum became something I could sleep inside. It was not good sleep, but it was sleep. Vareth Secundus was the second world of the Vareth system. A temperate planet with 2 small moons and an atmosphere that sat a few percentage points low on oxygen content, breathable without assistance for short periods, uncomfortable for extended exposure, requiring supplemental filtration for sustained operations. The Thurvik preferred it this way. I had learned during my time in system. The atmospheric discomfort was mild enough not to incapacitate human subjects, and pronounced enough to create a constant low-grade physiological cost that the Thurvak facility administrators found useful as a passive compliance mechanism. I had been on Secundus twice during my 6 years undercover. The first time was a brief survey pass in a borrowed transit shuttle, posing as a prospecting consultant, running mineral assessments in the outer system. I never landed, but I got close enough to run sensor sweeps and map the major year facility structures from low altitude. The second time I landed, as the acquisitions official, and spent 18 hours inside the primary bureau complex conducting the audit that extracted the manifest. 18 hours was not long enough to see everything. It was long enough to see more than enough. Primary facility occupied a managed plateau in the continent's northern temperate zone. The air, it looked like any large administrative complex, regularized structures, access roads, controlled perimeters, infrastructure visible in the form of power conduits and water management systems, and the kind of orderly landscape maintenance that large institutional facilities tend to impose. It looked like a hospital campus, or a university, or a government complex. Thurvik had a certain institutional aesthetic that prioritized clean lines and legible signage, and the appearance of professional competence. I had learned, during my 18 hours inside, that the appearance was accurate. The bureau was professionally competent. The records were immaculate. The facilities were climate-controlled and maintained to a standard that reflected the fact that the inventory needed to arrive at client purchasers in functional condition. The staff wore uniforms. The administrative hierarchy was clearly delineated. The documentation procedures were thorough. The Thurvak did not think of this as a moral failing. I had spent a great deal of time, during my 6 years in their space, trying to understand their cognitive framework around the program, not because I had any sympathy for it, but because understanding it was operationally necessary. What I had come to understand was that the Thurvak did not recognize a moral problem because they did not recognize a moral category. The humans in the program were not, in their taxonomy, beings for whom the question of consent or dignity or ownership was applicable. They were organic material with certain useful properties. The word, Curios, was not derogatory in their usage. It was categorical. It described a class of object that had aesthetic or functional interest. Objects could be acquired, valued, traded, and discarded. The Bureau was simply the administrative apparatus for doing this efficiently. The 18 hours I spent in the Bureau complex had required me to present this framework as though it were unremarkable. I had sat across tables from senior acquisitions officials and reviewed inventory reports and discussed distribution channel efficiency and raised no objection and expressed no horror and sustained the performance for 18 hours because the manifest required it, and because losing the performance would have produced no result except the loss of the manifest and probably my own processing into the system as a newly acquired curio. I had been good at the performance. I had been very good at it. I thought about this during the final approach transit, sitting in the intelligence operations bay of the Tanveth while the Compact's formation resolve around Verath Secundus. I thought about what the performance had cost. Not in the way that people who are interested in their own suffering think about costs. Practically, the way you audit a tool after extended use to see what wear it has accumulated. I concluded that the tool had accumulated significant wear and was still functional, and that this was the correct outcome under the circumstances. Major Fullo found me in the bay during the final approach and said, "You should be at your post." I said, "I am at my post. My post is wherever I'm useful. Right now that's here, reviewing the facility grid." She looked at the display in front of me. The sensor-mapped layout of the primary complex, with the assault element waypoints overlaid in red. She said, "You know this layout." "I know it as of 18 months ago. The Compact's forward recon shows some construction activity on the western perimeter. There's a new structure in Grid Sector 7 that wasn't there when I was last on site. I'm mapping it against the Bureau's administrative growth patterns to assess its probable function." She said, "Probable function?" I said, "Either an expansion of the intake processing facility, which would mean the program was scaling up, or an additional secure holding unit, which would mean they were having capacity issues in the primary holding sections, which would mean the population count in the active registry may be an undercount." Folau said nothing. She looked at the display. I said, I don't know which it is yet. I'll know more once the ground element is on site, she said. You're going in with the ground element, I said. I'm going in with the ground element as an analyst and facility guide. My name has been on the request since day 2 of planning. Compact Command approved it. She nodded. She looked at the display for another moment, then she looked at me. She said, Yale, whatever you need to do when we're down there. That's your call. I understood what she meant and I said, I'm going to do my job. She said, I know. The Compact's engagement with Varith Secundus's orbital defense structure began 14 hours before the ground element deployed, and I monitored it from the Tanveth's operations bay while continuing my facility assessment work. The Thurvak Dominion maintained a standing military presence in the Varath system, commensurate with what they considered the system's importance, which was significant, given Secundus's role as the administrative hub of their client network infrastructure. The orbital defense array comprised 16 fixed platform installations, a patrol flotilla of 43 mid-weight vessels, and a rapid response dock at the primary moon that held a further 22 heavier warships on standby rotation. The Compact had 380. I understood, in the abstract, what this ratio meant. I had understood it since the authorization instrument was signed. But there is a difference between understanding something in the abstract and watching it execute in real time on an operations display, and the difference is a specific quality of silence that settles into a room when a thing that was previously conceptual becomes actual. The 43 patrol vessels engaged at the outer perimeter of the orbital approach corridor and were addressed in 11 minutes. The 22 standby warships from the moon dock came out and were addressed in a further 8. The 16 fixed installations were addressed after the mobile assets were neutralized, beginning with the 3 that had fired on the Compact's lead elements and proceeding systematically through the remaining 13, which had either not fired or had transmitted signals that the Compact's communications intelligence team assessed as surrender attempts. Standing Order 14 Compact did not include a provision for accepting surrender of military assets engaged in defense of the operation's primary target. 16 installations were addressed on that basis. Then the ground element dropped. I went in on the 3rd Assault Shuttle Wave, the agreed plan, with a mixed element of 9th Brigade personnel and a small intelligence contingent, including a documentation specialist and 2 forensic analysts whose job was to secure the Bureau's records infrastructure before it could be wiped. We were wearing supplemental filtration for the atmospheric differential. Everyone had sidearms. I was carrying mine in a shoulder rig under my jacket, which was a habit from 6 years of fieldwork, and which I had no intention of changing. Came down on the western approach road, 2 kilometers from the primary complex perimeter. In the early hours of the local morning, the sun was just beginning to come up over the eastern range. A pale, slightly reddish light that had to do with the atmospheric composition, and that lit the dust and ash from the orbital approach in shades of amber and gold. The first wave had already been on the ground for 40 minutes. The perimeter security had been handled. The road to the complex was straight and maintained and lined with the low ornamental plantings that the Thurvak used on administrative campuses, and we walked it in formation, and the light kept coming up, and I had been on this road once before, in the reverse direction, walking away from 18 hours inside with the manifest in the transit case on my wrist. And I remember thinking then that the ornamental plantings were a very specific kind of wrong, that the care taken with them, the clean lines and the maintained borders, was a form of argument the Dominion was making with itself about its own nature, a visible claim. That the things that happened inside the complex were compatible with civilized institutional life. I thought about that again walking toward the complex with the 9th Brigade, in the amber gold light, the ash still settling from the orbital exchange overhead. The main entrance to the complex was a set of broad, low-stepped access points beneath a portico in the Thurvak institutional style. Horizontal emphasis, recessed lighting that was currently dark, signage in the Dominion administrative script above each door. The first wave had secured the entrance. There were Thurvak facility staff in the processing area just inside, 14 of them. hands visible, standing in a group against the far wall, under the supervision of 2 soldiers from the 4th Brigade element. The staff wore the Bureau uniforms. Their expression were the expressions of people who had understood very recently that something was happening and had not yet understood what it. I walked past them. The forensic documentation team went to the records infrastructure subbasement per the plan. I went with Folo's element toward the holding sections. The facility was larger than it had appeared from the outside, which was by design. The Thurvac had built downward as well as outward, and the holding sections were in the lower floors, where the climate control was more reliable and the external noise was reduced. We took the access stairs. The 9th Brigade element moved in a practiced, efficient column, weapons up but not raised, covering angles, communicating in the clipped shorthand of people who had trained for this environment. I was behind Folau and ahead of the element's rear security. I was not covering angles. I was thinking about the manifest. The lower access corridor was wide and lit with the steady, diffuse institutional lighting that the Thurvac used in spaces intended for prolonged occupation. The doors along it were standardized. The same dimensions, the same locking mechanism, the same small external display panel that showed inventory codes in the same alphanumeric format as the manifest. The codes were current. They updated as we passed, as the system registered our presence in the corridor and cross-referenced it against access, missions that we did not have and that we were not waiting for. Folau said, breaching. The element began moving through the doors. I will not describe all of what was in those rooms, because it is not my purpose here to provide a detailed account of the Thurvac's methods, which have been documented exhaustively by the Compact's forensic and medical teams, and which exist in the official record for anyone who requires specificity. What I will say is that each room had between 2 and 6 occupants. The occupants were human. They had been there for varying lengths of time. Some for months, some for what the medical teams would later assess as multiple years. They were alive, most of them. The medical teams who followed the ground element in the subsequent hours would find that 6% of the active population in the Secundus facility had reached the threshold the Bureau described as retired, still technically within the active inventory count, no longer viable for client distribution and being maintained at minimal resource expenditure. The medical teams would find that approximately 230 additional individuals were in conditions consistent with the early stages of the retired category. When I tell people that I did not lose my composure in those corridors, they sometimes look at me with an expression that suggests they do not believe me, or that they believe me, but find it troubling. I want to be clear about what I mean when I say I did not lose my composure. I mean that I continued to function. I answered questions from Folau's element when they needed facility orientation. I directed the documentation specialist toward the secondary record caches in the administrative subfloor that I had identified during my original survey. I assisted the medical intake team in reading the external display panels, which were in the Dominion administrative script, to sequence their room-by-room approach by estimated occupant condition. I was not composed in the sense of being undisturbed. I was composed in the sense of having already done all of my disturbance, alone, over 6 years in the field, and again during 19 days of transit, and again in quiet hours on the Tanvith reading sections of the manifest in my bunk. By the time I was walking those corridors, I had arrived at a state that was past disturbance. What I felt in those corridors was not grief, exactly, and it was not rage, exactly. It was something that didn't have a precise word, a kind of cold clarity, a sharpening of vision that made everything very specific and very present, and left very little room for anything that was not the immediate work. I stayed for 11 hours in the facility, working through the rehearsal actions with the documentation teams, as the medical element moved through ahead of us. By the early afternoon, the full extent of the Secundus holding population had been accounted for, 4,102 active individuals, of whom 3,841 were assessed as ambulatory or near ambulatory. The remaining 261 required immediate medical intervention. The 9th Brigade's Medical Corps and the 3 attached hospital ships in the compact formation began working through them in order of assessed urgency. The documentation team located the Bureau's primary records infrastructure in the subbasement and secured it before the administrative staff, able to execute the wipe protocol they had apparently been attempting from a terminal on the 2nd floor. The records were intact. Full documentation of 41 years of acquisition, processing, and distribution was intact. The new structure in Grid Sector 7, which I had been assessing during final approach, turned out to be neither an intake expansion nor an additional holding unit. It was a new administrative processing center, expanded intake capacity. Ground had been broken 18 months ago. Construction was approximately 60% complete. They had been expanding the program. It was mid-neck on the first day when the Thurvac administrator requested a meeting with the Compact's Ground Element Command. His name, in their naming convention, translated approximately as Vareth Secundus Second Administrator Teraval of House Inchith, which was a designation that encompassed both his official role and his hereditary clan affiliation, in the way the Thurvac combined professional and familial identity. He had been the senior administrator of the Secundus facility for 11 years. The forensic documentation team had already matched his authorization signatures to a significant proportion of the voided and retired status updates in the manifest. He was brought to the ground command post, which the 9th Brigade had established in what had been the Bureau's senior staff meeting, a large, high-ceilinged space with a long table and the kind of institutional finishings that translated across species as a room where people in authority met to discuss administrative matters. Folau was at the command post. I was there. 2 members of the Compact's general staff element were there. The administrator was brought in by a 2-soldier escort and seated across the table. He looked at us. He was not the species that showed fear in their eyes the way humans do. The Thurvac had a different physical register for emotional states that corresponded to fear and distress, and it manifested in coloration changes across their cranial plates and in the posture of their auxiliary limbs. The cranial plates were darkened. The auxiliary limbs were pulled very close to the body. He said, in the Dominion administrative dialect, "I want to know on what authority this action is being conducted." Folau said, Standing Order 14 Compact, authorized by the Parliament of the Federated Human Worlds. He said, "There is no recognized treaty mechanism that provides for," she said. "Recognized treaty mechanism is 9211. He was quiet, she said. The Dominion entered into diplomatic relations with the Federated Human Worlds 37 years ago. Those relations were maintained in good standing throughout the period during which this facility and its associated program were in operation. The Dominion has held permanent observer status at the Galactic Compact Council for 22 years. None of that changes the nature of what this facility is or what was done here," he said. "Biologic Companion Program has operated within the framework of Dominion law." "Yes," she said. He seemed uncertain how to continue. He tried a different approach. He said, "The current population of the facility is subject to processing contracts that have legal standing under Dominion commercial law. Disrupting those contracts without compensation." Folau said, "Their people," he said. "Under human taxonomy, perhaps," she said. "Under all taxonomy. Under any taxonomy that is not designed specifically to exclude them. Under the kind of taxonomy that your Bureau's own records demonstrate you have been aware of for 41 years. Because the entire conditioning infrastructure in this facility is designed to address specifically human psychological responses, which means your Bureau has been working with the full knowledge that these subjects have internal lives and psychological needs and are not inert, material, and chose to describe them as Curios anyway." He was quiet again. The cranial plates had darkened further. He said, "I would like to discuss terms." Folau said, "There are no terms," he said. "There must be an accommodation that can," she said. "There are no terms. The operation will proceed as authorized. The holding population will be evacuated to compact medical ships. The facility infrastructure will be addressed. The Bureau records will be secured and transferred. The secondary sites will be addressed by parallel operations currently underway. This is the complete account of what is happening here today, he said. If you intend to hold the administrative staff for tribunal, she said. I don't think that's what you came here to discuss. He was quiet. She said. You came here to determine whether there was a way to survive what is happening today. The answer is that this is not a negotiation. This is Standing Order 14 Compact being executed. I am informing you of that as a professional courtesy. You will be transferred to the Compact's military custody for tribunal processing. Your administrative staff will be processed separately. The facility will be addressed after the holding population is evacuated. He looked at the table. He said, something quiet in the Dominion dialect that I had spent a year learning. I translated it for the room, he said. We treated them well. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Folau said, no. She stood. She said to the escort, return him to holding. She said to the room, carry on. I stayed in my seat for a moment after the administrator was escorted out. The room had the feeling of a room that has just had something confirmed that everyone in it had already understood. I looked at the long table, the institutional finish, the chairs, the kind of room where people in authority had met for 11 years to discuss administrative matters. And I thought about the manifest entry that had said, diminutive specimen, limited utility, unprofitable to maintain. The administrator had said, we treated them well. I understood what he meant by it. The climate control. The intake procedures designed to minimize physical damage in transit. The behavioral conditioning that was gentle. By the program's internal standards. Because damaged merchandise sold at a discount. The maintained grounds. The clean lines. He had said it with the full sincerity of a person who believed it. I picked up my materials and left the room. The evacuation of the Secundus facility was completed in 31 hours. 4,102 individuals. Medical triage on site, transferred to the 3 hospital ships in the compact formation. Initial intake documentation by the identity recovery teams who had been deployed specifically to begin matching individuals against missing persons, records and the acquisition codes in the manifest. Many of the individuals had been in the facility for years. Some of them had been children when they were taken and were adults now. Some of them did not know their own names as they had been used before the Bureau replaced them with inventory codes. The identity recovery work would take months. Some of it would take years. Some of it would remain incomplete permanently. Reasons that I understood when I looked at the voided entries and the retired entries and the individuals from the active entries who had been in the facility long enough that the names they had been given by their families were not the first thing that came to mind when someone asked who they. I sat in on some of the initial intake interviews. Not all of them. There was too much work and too few hours in the day, and the intake teams, thorough and did not need me. But some of them, the ones where my knowledge of the Bureau's documentation system was useful for cross-referencing a specific code or an acquisition date. I will not describe those interviews either. They are in the record. They are not mine to describe here. What I will say is that there was a moment during the second day of the evacuation when I was in the hospital ship's intake bay and a woman was being brought through who had been in the Secundus facility for 9 years, according to the external display panel on her room. The identity recovery specialist working with her asked her name. She didn't answer for a moment. Then she said a name very quietly, and then she said, That's what my mother called me. Is that right? The specialist said, yes. That's your name. The woman said it again, twice, like she was testing its weight. I left the intake bay and went to the corridor and stood with my back against the wall and looked at the ceiling, which was the gray composite ceiling of a hospital ship's evacuation bay, and I held the pressure behind my eyes until it settled. Then I went back to work. The secondary sites fell in 72 hours. Parallel operations against the 2 confirmed secondary holding sites were executed simultaneously with the Secundus operation by detached, compact elements, 46 ships each, supported by ground assault units drawn from the 12th and 4th Brigades respectively. The first secondary site was a client world facility on a planet called Thurvesh Tertius in the Dominion's inner sphere, administered not by the Bureau directly, but by a client purchaser operating under Bureau licensing. Population at recovery, 612. The second was a transit hub facility on a commercial station in the Dominion's outer sphere that served as a short-term holding point for acquired subjects awaiting distribution to final purchasers. Population at recovery, 247. Tertiary site, the one I had probability assessments for but not confirmed coordinates, was located by the intelligence element based on signals intelligence from the Dominion's internal communications network, which the Compact had been monitoring since the orbital defense structure was addressed. It was a small facility, by the program's standards. Population at recovery, 88. Total recovered, 5,049. Of 9,211 documented acquisitions, 5,049 were recovered alive. The retired category, which the Bureau had defined as subjects removed from active service, represented individuals who had been returned to holding facilities or secondary clients in degraded condition. The forensic medical teams working the 4 sites found that the retired designation covered a range of conditions from serious physical deterioration to conditions from which the individuals were assessed as unlikely to recover. All of them were transferred to medical care. Outcomes for that category were compiled over subsequent months and are in the full record. The 661 voided entries were not recoverable. They were past recovery before the Compact was authorized, before I walked off the transit pod with the manifest, before I spent 6 years in Thurvac, space building toward the moment I could walk off that transit pod. 661 entries in the status field that said voided, and beside each one a remarks field that sometimes said nothing and sometimes said something that I had read once in the transit bay and had not read again. I knew the number. I had known the number for a long time. Knowing a number and accounting for it are not the same thing, and I had spent 6 years refusing to account for it because accounting for it had not been operationally useful, and now the operation was complete, and the accounting was available, and I found that I was not yet ready to do it. I told myself I would do it later, which is what I had been telling myself for 6 years, and which had the same truth value it had always had. The Ardent Compact departed Verath space on the 9th day. Before departure, the Compact's engineering element addressed the primary facility on Secundus, per the terms of the standing order, authorized destruction of infrastructure used in support of the extraction program. The secondary and tertiary sites were addressed by their respective detached elements on the same timeline. The Bureau's records infrastructure, secured during the ground operation, was transferred in full to the Compact's Intelligence Division for use in the ongoing forensic work of recovering the identities of the 9,211 individuals in the manifest. I watched the primary facility addressed from the viewport of the Tanvith as the formation assembled for departure. The plateau in the northern temperate zone, the clean lines, the maintained grounds, the ornamental plantings in their ordered borders, came apart in the way that engineered structures come apart when the engineering is applied in the other direction, systematically, completely, and without remainder. The dust and ash rose into the reddish atmospheric light, and the formation turned away, and Verath Secundus diminished behind us. I was standing at the viewport alone. Major Folau came and stood beside me after a few minutes, but did not say anything. We watched until the planet was no longer distinguishable from the other lights in the formation's rear field of view. She said, eventually, "We got 5,049. I said, "Yes," she said, "and the accounting is going to take years. The identity work, getting people home. There are people in those intake bays who don't know where home is anymore." I said, "I know." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is that what you were thinking about?" I said, "I was thinking about what the administrator said." She said, "That they treated them well." "Yes," she said, "he meant it." "I know he meant it," I said. "That's what I was thinking about." He meant it with complete sincerity. He has spent 11 years administering a facility that processed human beings as commercial inventory, and he looked across that table at you and said, "Turt, we treated them well." And he believed it the way I believe that water is wet. He built his professional identity around having done this correctly. around having run an efficient, well-maintained program that handled its inventory with appropriate care. That was his benchmark. That was the full extent of what he thought the moral question was. Folo said, and the Dominion has been a recognized member of Galactic Diplomatic Society for 37 years, I said. They sat on the Compact Council. They sent delegations. They signed instruments. They participated in the full apparatus of interstellar civilization for 37 years, while the Bureau processed 9,211 human beings through its intake system and assigned them inventory codes and sold them to client purchasers and logged their exits from service with status fields that said voided. She said, yes. And until I walked off a transit pod with a manifest in a case on my wrist, I said, no one closed the account. Shh. The words were in my mouth before I had thought them through, and once they were in my mouth I understood something about them that I had not understood before. I had been thinking about the 661 voided entries. I had been carrying them for 6 years. But the thing I was actually thinking about, standing at that viewport, was not the 661. It was the 37 years. The fact that it had been possible, within the recognized framework of interstellar civilization, this to continue for 37 years without consequence. The fact that it had continued because no one had the documentation. Yes, also because the recognized framework of interstellar civilization had not built into itself the expectation that something like this could be happening inside its recognized membership. The Thurvac had been transparent about what they were, in their own language, in their own administrative records. They had maintained immaculate documentation of what they had done. The documentation was not hidden. It was archived, accessible to credentialed personnel within their system, organized according to their bureaucratic standards, treated as exactly what it was. A record of ordinary commercial activity. The only thing that had been missing was someone on the other side willing to do what I had done for 6 years, and willing to bring what I had brought to someone like Price, and willing to wait for an authorization instrument that, seems said, full and complete redress of account. The Ardent Compact had been 380 warships. The Thurvac Dominion's Verith system defense had been 81. The ratio was the message. The standing order had been written with the ratio in mind, not 380, because 380 was required to defeat 81. 380, because the Parliament had understood, when it voted, that the answer needed to be legible at a distance. That anyone in galactic space who looked at what had been done to 9,211 human beings and looked at the 380 ships that answered it needed to understand, without ambiguity or nuance, what the calculus was. One human being taken and processed as inventory was not a diplomatic incident. It was a declaration. The declaration said, "We do not recognize your category of being. We do not accept the framework in which you exist as persons. You are material to us, and material can be acquired and valued and discarded." 380 warships said, "We heard the declaration, here is ours." I had thought about this in the transit bay on the Tanvith, reading sections of the manifest by the light from my bunk's reading panel. Shh. I had thought about the administrator's belief that he had treated them well. I had thought about what it meant that his benchmark for well was so categorically different from mine that we were not, in any meaningful sense, using the same word. I had thought about the ornamental plantings. I had concluded at some point during the 19 days of transit that this was what the ratio was for, not punishment in the human sense, not proportionality, not an eye for an eye. The compact wasn't proportional. 380 warships against 81 was not proportional. It was not meant to be. It was meant to establish, with the kind of clarity that leaves no interpretive room, that the framework the Thurvac had operated within. The framework in which the question of whether a human being was a being with moral standing was a legitimate question with potentially negative answers, was not a framework that would continue to operate unmolested. The administrator had looked across the table and said, "We treated them well." And Folau had said, "No." And she had stood up and ended the meeting, and the operation had continued. That was the message. Standing at the viewport, watching Vareth Secundus become indistinguishable from the other lights, I thought that the message had been delivered with appropriate clarity. I filed my final intelligence assessment from the Tanveth 3 days before we reached Mirova Station. It was a thorough document: facility layout, population assessment, record status, operational timeline, lessons for future similar operations. I included a scene on the Thurvac administrative framework and the way it had insulated the program from internal recognition as a moral problem, because I thought it was analytically important and because future analysts working on similar situations in other parts of galactic space might find it useful. I did not include a section on what I had felt during the 11 hours in the lower sections of the primary facility, during the intake bay on the hospital ship, or standing at the viewport during departure. That material was not relevant to an intelligence assessment. Price read the assessment and sent me a message that said the document was thorough and that I should plan to take a period of leave following debriefing. I sent back a message that said I would consider it. He sent back a message that said, in its entirety, "You are taking leave. This is not a consideration, Yale." I sent back, "Yes, Director." The identity recovery work began on the hospital ships during the transit back and continued after we reached Mirova Station, and the recovered individuals were transferred to the reception facilities that had been established there. I was not part of the recovery team. My work was intelligence, not resettlement, but I attended the daily briefings and read the case summaries, and over the following weeks I followed the progress of the cross-referencing effort. 6 weeks after we arrived at Mirova Station, the recovery team was able to formally confirm the identity of 3,412 of the 5,049 recovered individuals. The remaining 1,537 remained under assessment. Some because their time in the facility had complicated the documentation process in ways that required additional work. Some because they needed to cross-reference against were incomplete, had been lost. Some because their circumstances before acquisition had not included the kind of documentation trail that made cross-referencing straightforward. The team expected to resolve most of the remaining cases within 6 months. A small number might take longer. The 661 voided entries were formally addressed in the recovery report as individuals for whom the recovery effort had not been possible. The report listed what was known about each one: inventory code, acquisition date, port of acquisition, date of voided status entry, approximately 40% of them. There was sufficient information to cross-reference against missing persons records and establish probable identities with reasonable confidence. For the remaining 60%, the information available was insufficient for confident identification. I read that section of the recovery report twice. Then I requested a copy of the formal voided cross-reference database from the records team, and I spent 3 days working through it, adding what I knew from my own acquisition code cross-referencing work to the cases where I had matched entries during my time in the field. I added 41 additional probable identifications to the 60% that had been assessed as insufficient for confident match. 41 from 6 years of field work. It was not enough. I knew that when I submitted it, and I knew it when the records team acknowledged receipt and logged it into the database, and I knew it in the way I had known it since I first read the status field entries in the manifest on the transit to Mirova Station. There is a kind of knowledge that is not ignorance, that has all the information it needs and still cannot reach resolution. And the knowledge about those 661 entries had that quality. I knew the number. I knew what the number meant. I knew what had been done, and by whom, and that the compact had addressed it in full, and that the administrator was in tribunal custody, and that the records were secure, and that 3,412 people were in the process of going home. I knew all of it. The account was closed. That is what I tell people when they ask how it ended. The account was closed, not resolved. There is no resolving what happened to the people in those rooms, or what happened to the 661 Or what happens to someone whose name they have to be given back because the years took it from them? Resolution is not the category. The category is, the compact was authorized, the compact executed, the standing order has no expiration date, and the Thurvik Dominion's Bureau of Biologic Acquisitions will not open its intake protocols again. The account is closed. The 37 years before the manifest came home. That account is also in the record now. That is what the ratio was for. That is what 380 warships said to the parts of galactic space that were paying attention. The ornamental plantings are gone. The inventory codes still exist in the database, and the recovery team is still working through them, and I still read the daily case summaries every morning before I start my work. I expect I will continue reading them for some time. The account is closed. The names are still coming home.